From Matt McAllister, and he says, first of all, he wants to thank you for sharing your wisdom so graciously and generously. But he says, of the 5 people or so you most admire, could you please name a few so that we might become more familiar with and potentially learn from these individuals?
Well, I don't have any one person that I admire. I would argue that the greatest governmental leader whose life overlapped mine was Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. And I would argue that he was the one that taught Deng Xiaoping of China how to fix China the way Singapore had fixed itself. And so it was a huge achievement. So I've seen some remarkable, I think the Marshall Plan that my country did after World War II was a marvelous thing, and that was a credit to the human race. I've seen a lot that I'm proud of. On the other hand, I see a lot now that I'm not proud of. I don't like this crazy hatred in our party system. I don't see anything wrong with having a good-sized government safety net that goes up as GDP. I think we'd be crazy to be as rich as we are without a good governmental safety net. By the way, you know where that came from? Otto Bismarck. He was the Iron Chancellor of Germany, exercising the unlimited power of a German king. That's who gave us some Social Security and so forth. Nobody thinks of Otto Bismarck as a great hero of democratic capitalism, but he really was. It shows how complicated life is. Strange things happen. My hero, Otto Bismarck. I've never seen Otto Bismarck's picture on an American wall. He should be there. My favorite political system in terms of being adapted to its particular circumstances successfully is Singapore. I think Singapore is the single most successful governmental system that exists in the world. They've taken a small swamp from no to a very creditable place. They're doing the Lord's work in a number of very important ways. I'm sorry they're bringing in derivatives trading. Even heaven makes mistakes. I think Singapore's habit of stepping hard on things that will grow like cancer is the correct way to govern. And in America, we tend to wait till they're unfixable and then we want to fix them. How well are you going to, if you won't attack a problem while it's solvable and wait till it's unfixable, you can argue that you're so damn foolish that you deserve the problem. You take Singapore, a terrible malaria problem, it's a swamp. He drains the swamps. He does not care if some little fish dies. No, he has a drug problem. He searches the world over for the right solution to the drug problem. He finds it in the United States. Isn't that an interesting thing? Imagine somebody in Singapore reading books and deciding the United States was the answer to Singapore's problem. He copied the military's drug bottle policy. Anybody in Singapore will pee in a bottle instantly on demand, and if they flunk, they go immediately to a tough compulsory rehab. Away went the drug problem. Just time after time after time, he made these winning decisions. He wanted the place to be prosperous. He figured out who he wanted to come in, and he made the civilization very user-friendly to what he wanted to attract. And it worked. His approach to marriage was interesting. The average very successful man in the Asian culture marries an exceptionally good-looking woman who's somewhat dumber than he is. It's the system. This guy was so smart that he was the second-ranked student in his high school. And the student that was 1/10 of a percentage point higher was female. So he didn't follow the Asian rule of hiring the beautiful woman with the big boobs, who's a little dumber than you are. He married this woman that was 1/10 of a point higher. And who is now the Prime Minister of Singapore? Their son. I mean, this is a very unusually successful man. It's a very unusually successful history. If you will make a study of the life and work of Lee Kuan Yew, you will find one of the most interesting and instructive political stories written in the history of mankind. This is better than Athens. You will learn a lot that will be useful in your own life. Study the life and work of Lee Kuan Yew. You're going to be flabbergasted. I'm a big fan for what's happening in China. As a matter of fact, I've just prepared a bust of Lee Kuan Yew, the recently deceased ex-prime minister of Singapore, because I think he's contributed so much to fixing first Singapore and then China. One of the things Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore was to stop the corruption, including cashiering some of his close friends. And China's doing the same thing. And I consider it the smartest damn thing I've seen a big country do in a long, long time. And I think that it's hard to set the proper example if the leading political rulers are kleptocrats. You know, you don't want to be run by a den of thieves. You want responsible people. And what Lee Kuan Yew did is he paid the civil servants way better and recruited very good people. And he just created a better system. And of course, China is widely copying him. And it's a wonderful thing they're doing. So I'm very high on what's going on in China, and I think it's very likely to work. They've actually shot a few people. That really gets people's attention. Percent of the population of China was illiterate and mired in subsistence, poverty, and agriculture. Now and they've been through horrible wars, and look at them. It's one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of the earth, and a few people made an extreme contribution to it, including this Chinese politician in Singapore. And I give the Communist Party a lot of credit for copying Lee Kuan Yew. That's all Berkshire does, is copy the right people. As far as Lee Kuan Yew is going, I just realized I'd made a mistake when he died. I'm going to commission a bust of Lee Kuan Yew and stick it somewhere important. That is the most important governmental leader. It's the most important nation builder that ever existed in the history of the world. There is no other record equal to Lee Kuan Yew's. Unbelievable achievement. A malarial swamp turned into a modern civilized powerhouse. And then using that example to utterly change and transform China. And not only China, but Vietnam. It was the example of Lee Kuan Yew that the North Koreans, of all people, turned to turn Vietnam into a powerhouse that's civilizing. There's never been a career like Lee Kuan Yew. There was one person in Lee Kuan Yew's high school that was smarter than he was, and it was a female 1 year older. So he married her. And of course, his son is the Prime Minister of Singapore. Yeah. This guy just is very rational. When he came to power, he's surrounded by Muslims who hate him. He has no assets, no army, no nothing. He's in a dangerous position. He realizes that in his new nation, he has to have an army. And he asks the world to help him create an army, a defense system. Everybody in the world declines. After all, it's a malarial swamp. And one country says, we'll help you. And it was Israel. He said, how can I have Israel help me when the Muslims hate Israel and I'm surrounded by Muslims who hate me? He solved his problem. He accepted help from the Israelis and he told everybody they were Mexicans. It's been a privilege to live in the same world with a man who accomplishes so much discipline and intelligence and decency. He totally eliminated bribery. When he went on his anti-corruption kick, one of the first person that succumbed it wasn't his best friend, it was almost his best friend. And when the guy committed suicide, the wife came to him, who was also a friend, and said, Chinese culture, committing suicide is a loss of face for the family. Can we cover the suicide up? He said, I cannot help you in any way. This guy was very tough about getting done what had to be done. Singapore was a very corrupt place. And if his example causes China to clean up, which looks to me like it's a better than 50% bet, It'll be one more unbelievable example of the achievements of probably the most admirable man, judging by consequences. How are you smart enough to know how good Lee Kuan Yew was? What's your background?
I just read about you all the time, that's all.
Well, I've got an echo.
What are the chances of that culture continuing with the current government and future governments in Singapore?
Well, they're pretty good. Lee Kuan Yew left a base. He eliminated the corruption, made it hard to get in, and paid the people enough a lot. There's no real incentive to steal in Singapore. If you're either in Parliament or an advanced government administrator, you get paid very well. And Confucian civilization, you're admired and so forth. No, I think what he's left in Singapore will continue to do very well. But of course, he rose when he was doing it and China wasn't. Now Singapore has to compete with China. That makes it harder. Well, what China adopted from Singapore was not its total management system. It adopted its system of economic management of business. It had private ownership of business and so forth. And before that, the Chinese government had owned practically everything. And Lee never felt that his exact Singaporean system with its democracy would necessarily be the right place for China immediately. It may well be that some other model will work better for a place as big and as backward as China was. And it may well be that the system of the Chinese lucked into by accident, when they took part of what was done in Singapore, it may have been about right for China. Lee Kuan Yew may have been the best nation builder that ever lived. He took over an malarial swamp with no assets, no natural resources, no nothing, surrounded by a bunch of Muslims who hate him. And he creates in a very short time, by historical standards, modern Singapore. Now China's more important because they're more Chinese, but you can give Lee Kuan Yew a lot of the credit for creating modern China. Because those pragmatic communist leaders, they saw a bunch of Chinese that were rich when they were poor, and they said, "The hell with this." Remember, the old communist said, "I don't care whether the cat is black or white, I care whether it catches mice." And he wanted some of the success that Singapore got, and he copied the playbook. So I think the communist leadership that copied Lee Kuan Yew was right. I think Lee Kuan Yew was right. And of course, I have two busts of somebody else in my house. One is Benjamin Franklin and the other is Lee Kuan Yew. So,
Wow.
if you want one mantra, it comes from a Chinese gentleman who just died, Lee Kuan Yew, who was the greatest nation builder probably that ever lived in the history of the world. And he said one thing over and over and over again all his life: figure out what works and do it. You just go at life with that simple philosophy from your own national group, you will find it works wonderfully well. Figure out what works and do it.
And figuring out what works means figuring out how other people
Of course.
behave.
Of course.
And Charlie and I have seen the extremes in human behavior, and in so many unexpected ways. And
Now we get it every night.
you know,
Extremes of human behavior.
yeah,
All you got to do is turn on the television.
yeah. I'm glad he used that example.
The existing system is so overexpensive and overcomplicated. In Singapore, they spend 20% of what we spend in America on medical care, and their system is way better. And what they're doing is just the most elemental common sense. But of course, it was created by one Chinese guy who was in control. Of course, it's more intelligent than the outcome of our political process. That Singapore system was created by the Lee Kuan Yew. Of course, it works better. But to have it cost 20% and work better in an advanced place like Singapore, so there's a lot to be demoralized about in terms of the potential of our medical care system. And of course, It isn't that our politicians are good at fixing systems like that. So, if you don't like it now, I confidently predict you won't like it later either.
My name is Lazar Hersey. I wanted to go back to Singapore and ask you a question involving Lee Kuan Yew, particularly his housing policies, to avoid kind of the social evils that Lee Kuan Yew has managed to avoid back in Singapore. Thank you.
Well, that's like asking some ordinary klutz who's drunk if he can't come up with something like Albert Einstein. You know, it's just too much. Lee Kuan Yew was the best nation builder that probably ever existed, and what he accomplished in Singapore, considering what he started with, was a miracle. And of course, I don't know how to create that everywhere. I'm not sure Lee Kuan Yew could have done it if he didn't have a bunch of his fellow Chinese there. I'm not sure that any other ethnic group would have done it. I think he had it looked like a terrible hand.
We have a question from Stephen Chen. Charlie, you have been a long-time admirer of Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew. You once said that study the life and work of Lee Kuan Yew, you are going to be flabbergasted. I would be curious to know, how did you start your interest about Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew, and have you met Lee Kuan Yew in person, and if there is one thing the world could learn from Singapore now, what would that be?
Well, Lee Kuan Yew had the best record as a nation builder. If you're willing to count small nations in the group, he had probably the best record that ever existed in the history of the world. He took over a malarial swamp with no army, no nothing. And pretty soon, he turned that into this gloriously prosperous place. And his method for doing it was so simple. You know, the mantra he said over and over again, it's very simple. He said, figure out what works and do it. Now, it sounds like anybody would know that made sense. But, you know, most people don't do that. They don't work that hard at figuring out what works and what doesn't. And they don't just keep everlastingly at it the way he did. And again, he was a very smart man. And he had a lot of good ideas, and he absolutely took over a malarial swamp and turned it into modern Singapore in his own lifetime. It was absolutely incredible. And he did not have, he was a one-party system, but he could always be removed by the electorate. He was not a dictator. And he was just so good. He was death on corruption, which was a very good idea. And in fact, there's hardly anything he touched he didn't improve. When I look at modern Singapore health system, it costs 20% of what the American system costs. And of course, it works way better than our medical system. And that's entirely due to the practical talent of Lee Kuan Yew. Just time after time, he would choose the right system. And in Singapore, you get a savings account the day you're born. And if you don't spend the money, you and your heirs get to spend it eventually. In other words, it is your money. So that to some extent, everybody buying medical service in Singapore is paying for it himself. And of course, people behave more sensibly when they're spending their own money. He just, time after time, he would do something like that. He recognized reality and worked way better than other people were doing. And there aren't that many people like Lee Kuan Yew that have ever lived. So of course I admire him. I have a bust of Lee Kuan Yew in my house. I admire him that much.
Lee would like to know, Mr. Munger, your advice given on choosing a good spouse in For Charlie's Almanac is terse. You have said that the single best way is to deserve a good spouse, because a good spouse is by definition not nuts. That is true and makes sense. However, could you be more specific? You used examples of Lee Kuan Yew's good judgment in choosing someone with brains over certain physical attributes in your past interviews. Could you give more examples, both good and bad ones, from your personal observations or vicarious readings?
Well, I can't top Lou's example. In his early education, he was the second-ranked student in the school. He was that smart. And there was one woman who was a year older than he was, who was the first-ranked student in the school. So he married her. And of course, his son, who was a bright man, is now, Prime Minister of Singapore. A little wisdom in spouse selection is very desirable. You can hardly think of a decision that matters more to human felicity than who you marry.